This is the Fantasy Football Podcast, where we take data and convert it into fantasy success. No bias, no hot takes, only victory. This is the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast, and now your host, Dustin Chandry. Welcome into episode 13 of the Fantasy Alchemist Podcast. I'm your host, Dustin Chandry. And today, I'm going to talk about waiver wire targets for week 3. Now, as it relates to the waiver wire, I think working the waiver wire is more important than your initial draft, right? You can work around a mediocre draft, but you have to be active. Now, case in point, last week, Puka Nacua was an obvious pickup. In auction leagues, FAAB leagues, I said you needed to be really aggressive and targeted him. Now, I targeted Nacua in every league that I could. In fact, in one Dynasty league, I burned 60% of my FAAB dollars on him, and I feel really good about it after week 2. Now, we're 2 weeks in, and you shouldn't be afraid to drop players that you drafted. Now, of course, there has to be some context. Joe Burrow had a terrible first 2 weeks. I'm not talking about players like that. But this week, you should be dropping players like Antonio Gibson for Jerome Ford. You should be dropping players like Cortland Sutton for Tutu Atwell. Both of these examples are players I'm recommending today on the waiver claim that have a lower rostership in ESPN leagues than the 2 players I compared them to. And what's also interesting is that some of the players that I'm talking about today reappear again after last week's waiver wire episode. That's indicating either how much bias there is earlier in the year to players that people drafted, or just how many league mates are just inactive during the middle of the week. And because some of the players mentioned in last week's waiver wire episode saw a pretty significant jump in their roster ownership, but not to the degree that I would expect. So let's discuss waiver wire targets for week 3. Now let's briefly start with players who were below 50% rostership last week, but still have some limited availability in some leagues. Now let's start with the obvious one, and that is breakout rookie Puka Nacua of the LA Rams. Now last week he was below 5% rostership. He has skyrocketed up to 73% currently. That means he's still available right now in a quarter of leagues. This is a guy who, in the first 2 weeks of the season and the first 2 weeks of his career, has been wide receiver 9 and wide receiver 2 last week. 15 targets in week 1, 20 targets in week 2, 100 receiving yards in each of those 2 games, 21.9 fantasy points in week 1, 30.1 fantasy points in week 2, and he hasn't even found the end zone yet. Now, I'll talk more about Nacua in my week 2 observations, but like I said, he's still free in almost a quarter of ESPN leagues. Please go get him if he is there. I picked him up after his week 1 breakout in every league that I could, and somehow he got even better in week 2. I think Nacua is a lock to be a top 20 receiver by the end of the season, and he is still free in a quarter of ESPN leagues. And Puka Nacua's teammate, running back Kyren Williams, he's still available in more than a third of ESPN leagues right now. He has a rostership of 61% entering the week 3 waiver wire. Now, the Rams deactivated Cam Akers, who was presumed to be the starter going into the year, and now it looks like they're trying to trade him. They tried this last year. They were unable to do it. Who knows if they'll be able to be successful this year. But regardless, Williams has catapulted into the running back 1 position on the team, and I think he's a solid running back 2 in fantasy for the rest of the season. Williams finished as running back 9 in week 1 and running back 2 in week 2. He's got 3 total touchdowns on the season. And what was most impressive is that he got 10 targets in week 2, caught 6 balls, 48 yards, and had a receiving touchdown. So Kyren Williams not only should be well over 90% rostered in ESPN leagues, this guy should be in your starting lineup. He should be a top 20 running back as long as he remains healthy. Another player that is hovering around that 60% range is Texans wide receiver Nico Collins, currently at 62% ownership, entering the week 3 waiver wire. Now, what's interesting is the Texans are passing way more than I anticipated starting the year. Now, CJ Stroud is in the top 10 in passing attempts with 41 pass attempts in week 1, and he increased to 47 attempts in week 2. Now, receiver Nico Collins was one of the league leaders in air yards in week 1, and he seemed to have a breakout game in week 2. He had 7 receptions on 9 targets, 146 yards, and a touchdown. He had 27.6 fantasy points, and he finished as wide receiver 5. Now, Collins should be well over 80% rostered, and I think is a solid flex option moving forward. So double check that Collins is not available in your league. Now, this last recommendation is only really related to your standard 1 quarterback leagues, but after week 1, Daniel Jones got dropped by a fair amount of leagues after the Giants got absolutely crushed by the Cowboys, and Daniel Jones had an abysmal week 1 performance, both on the field and from a fantasy standpoint. Now, entering the week 3 waiver wire, Daniel Jones is only rostered in 72% of leagues. That's a quarter of leagues right now where Daniel Jones is available. And then, of course, in week 2, Daniel Jones finished as the quarterback 1 on the week with over 32 points, the only quarterback who broke the 30-point mark. And Daniel Jones, honestly, he doesn't get enough credit for being a quality rushing quarterback that gives him some additional floor. You see, last year, he was in the top 5 in rushing yards and rushing touchdowns for quarterbacks. And in week 2, he gave you 12 fantasy points, 59 yards, and a rushing touchdown just from his legs. Now, Daniel Jones was drafted as a fringe quarterback 1, and there's a chance that you can actually still get him for free. I still think Daniel Jones should be ranked somewhere in that quarterback 11 to 14 range on any given week. Now, before we get into waiver wire targets with less than 50% ownership, make sure to follow us on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod. We are now blue check verified. Again, it's at FFAlchemistPod. You can also email us directly at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com. Now, the highest priority ad this week for players under 50% rostership is going to be Browns running back Jerome Ford, currently at 9% ownership entering the week 3 waiver claim. Now, Ford entered the season as the clear running back 2 on the team, and of course now he's going to be lifted into that running back 1 role with the season-ending injury to Nick Chubb. Now there will be other running backs I recommend, but Ford should be the priority. 1, he played really well, and we'll get to that here in a minute. But 2, this is his backfield now for the remainder of the year as long as he can stay healthy. None of the other running backs I'm going to recommend have that assurance and safety that this is their backfield for the rest of the season. So this puts Ford as the priority. Now, as for what he did in week 2 in relief, he had a really great night, right? He had 130 total yards. He got 3 of 4 targets. He averaged 6.6 yards per carry. Now, I will caution that Ford did have a really good-looking 69-yard run last night, and without it, Ford then would be below 2.5 yards per carry. However, Ford still went for 25 fantasy points last night, and I think he profiles as a solid flex option for the remainder of the season. And again, he's at 9% ownership, so he should be widely available in all leagues. And if you're in an auction league, I don't like to throw a lot of money at running backs. This might be an exception given the situation that Ford is now locked in as the RB1 for the Browns for the rest of the year. I'd be comfortable going a quarter to even a third of my FAAB dollars to acquire Jerome Ford if I was in need at the running back position, especially if I was the one who had Nick Chubb. Now, the next running back is a little bit over 50%, so I'm kind of cheating here, but I'm going to include him, and that's Eagles running back Kenny Gainwell, who's at 56% ownership right now heading into week 3 waivers. Now, I think we're all aware what DeAndre Swift did in week 2. It was sensational, but I still think Gainwell is going to be the starter going forward, right? He was the clear starter in week 1, and when both guys were available, Gainwell had a 62% snap participation compared to only 28% for Swift. I think Gainwell likely would have played in week 2 had it not been a Thursday night game. And look, I know Swift had a great game, but I don't think that drastically changes Philly's plans. If Gainwell is healthy, I think he steps back into the lead back role behind one of the best O-lines in the league. You see, in week 1, Gainwell had 18 opportunities. He had almost 80 total yards, and he had a double-digit fantasy output. And he's available in almost half of all ESPN leagues. So if you miss out on Ford, I think Gainwell is a good consolation prize. Now, the other running back who's available in 2/3 of ESPN leagues right now is Colts running back Zach Moss. Now, Moss, simply put, just had elite usage returning from the arm injury. Moss played 98% of snaps. He had 22 opportunities, including catching all 4 targets. He had over 100 total yards, and he had a touchdown. And I think what was actually really surprising was how well he ran. He had almost 5 yards a carry in week 2. and Moss finished as a top 10 running back on the week with over 20 fantasy points. And like I said, Moss is available in 2/3 of ESPN leagues, and I think he should be started as long as Jonathan Taylor remains out or away from the team. And one sleeper acquisition I think you could make will be Saints running back Kendre Miller. Now, Miller was a third-round pick in last April's NFL draft. He ran for 1,400 yards, 7 touchdowns. He averaged 6.2 yards per carry his senior year at TCU. He showed that he had some capability as a receiver, too. Now, Alvin Kamara has 1 game left on his suspension. Jamal Williams left week 2 injured, and he wasn't great in week 1 or 2, even when he was healthy. And now he's been sidelined for the last month with a hamstring injury himself, but he was questionable coming into week 2, meaning he's closer to game action. And if Williams is out and Kamara is still suspended, Miller could fall into a large snap share for a team who likes to run the football, right? The Saints had the most rushing attempts of any team last year. Now, I wouldn't spend any FAAB dollars on Kendre Miller, but he's definitely a guy I would be keeping an eye on as the week progresses. If Williams looks like he's out and Miller looks like he's in, he could be a quick 1-week fill-in before Kamara returns. And then the other speculative ad that I would alert you to right now will be Dolphins running back Jeff Wilson. Now, Wilson started the season on IR. He's eligible to return to play in week 5, making him an ideal target here in week 3, because I think many of your league mates have probably forgotten about him. Now, if you have an open IR spot or you need help at the running back position, I think this is probably your safety net option for the week after Gainwell and Moss and Ford. I think Wilson could rejoin the Dolphins in a committee with Raheem Mostert, right? Mostert has been very good as the lead back through 2 games, but Mostert is still a 31-year-old running back with a history of getting hurt pretty frequently. So Wilson, I think, is a good stash if you have the opportunity on your bench. He is available in 2/3 of ESPN leagues right now. Now, as for the wide receiver position, we talked about Rams rookie phenom Puka Nacua, but his teammate Tutu Atwell has been pretty good himself. Atwell continues to impress, right? He had 17.9 fantasy points in week 1, and he had another 15.2 in week 2. And most importantly, in week 2, Atwell played 94% of the team's snaps. He was up from 79% the prior week. Atwell has a really solid floor. He's getting nearly 10 targets a game and nearly 100 yards receiving in the first 2 weeks. And Atwell is available for free in 2/3 of ESPN leagues. And then lastly, for the tight end position, we have 2 recommendations this week. The first one is kind of surprising, right? There is a tight end that is available in 2/3 of ESPN leagues who finished as the tight end 1 in week 2 and the tight end 2 in week 2 with 19.1 and 20.2 fantasy points in the first 2 weeks. That's Patriots tight end Hunter Henry, and he should be a priority waiver claim at the tight end position. Each of the last 2 games, Henry has seen 6 targets, 5 receptions, 50 yards, and he got a touchdown in both games. And the Pats are one of the league leaders in snaps and passing attempts, and Henry saw over 92% snap participation in week 2. Hunter Henry seems like a locked-in top 10, potentially even top 5 tight end the rest of the way, and he is free in 2/3 of ESPN leagues. And the other tight end that is available in half of ESPN leagues right now is Lions rookie Sam Laporta. Now, Laporta has similar metrics to Henry. The only difference is he has no touchdowns. Laporta is playing over 80% of snaps, and in 2 weeks he's caught 10 of 11 targets with an average of 10 yards per reception. All Laporta needs right now for a top 5 week at the position is to find the end zone, and he's free right now in 50% of leagues. So that'll wrap up today's episode. Make sure to hit subscribe and leave a review. We'll be back midweek with a full week 2 rundown with observations and takeaways across the NFL, and then we'll prepare for week 3 with players you shouldn't be afraid to start by Friday. So this is Dustin Chandry signing off for the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Fantasy Alchemist podcast. You can follow the pod on Twitter at FFAlchemistPod or email us at fantasyalchemistpodcast@gmail.com.